Welcome back to Crypto Matrix X, and let me hit you with something that might jolt your brain awake. Imagine rolling out of bed one morning and finding out your 1000 XRP is suddenly worth the down payment on a house. Sounds like something people only fantasize about, right? Maybe. But the fact is, a lot of noise has been circulating lately about a future where major banks worldwide start using XRP at scale. And if even 20% of those whispers ever become reality, the numbers get insane real fast. Now, before you think I'm about to sell you a fairy tale, slow down. I'm not here to hype you up. I'm here to take you through the possibilities and call out what's realistic, what's not, and what's actually worth paying attention to. You want accuracy, not fluff. So that's what you're getting. A lot of us share that same mark in the back of our minds, 1000 XRP. It's a milestone number. I get not too small, not too huge, just enough to make you to wonder what if this thing finally does what it was built to do. And if you look at wallet data on-chain, you'll find that hundreds of thousands of XRP holders sit right in that 500 to 1000 XRP range. So trust me, you're not the only one playing this mental simulation. But here's the real question everyone keeps dancing around. If XRP becomes a core mechanism for global liquidity, what does 1000 XRP actually look like in that world? Does it help you breathe a little easier financially? Does it buy you a new car? Or is it barely enough to matter? To answer that without bullshitting you, I dug into 3 different hypothetical worlds. Let's call them 3 alternate universes, each based on different levels of bank usage. And no, these aren't Fantasyland projections, like the TikTok kids who scream XRP to $10,000 tomorrow. These are grounded in actual liquidity models, global settlement volume, and XRP's supply mechanics. Each scenario paints a completely different picture. In the first universe, XRP becomes a dominant banking rail. In the second, it's used moderately across global payments. And in the third, it's more of a reserved liquidity asset sitting quietly behind the scenes. 3 worlds, 3 vastly different outcomes, and 3 very different values for that same 1000 XRP bag. Let's start with the wildest one, and the mega bank adoption scenario. This is the version of reality everyone secretly hopes for, but is too scared to say out loud. In this universe, XRP grabs about 10% of Swift's yearly volume. And considering that Swift moves around $150 trillion per year, 10% of that is $15 trillion in value flowing through XRP. Now let that sink in, $15 trillion. If you want XRP to process transactions at that level without breaking, the ecosystem would need trillions of dollars worth of XRP locked up as liquidity. You cannot move that much value without deep, deep pools. You crunch that liquidity requirement against the circulating supply, and you get a price point that shocks most people. About $83 per XRP. Yeah, $83 for a single coin. And before you start rolling your eyes, no, this number isn't pulled out of thin air. This is just simple math based on volume versus circulating supply versus liquidity required. If XRP ever traded at $83, your 1000 XRP becomes $83,000. That's not a retirement, but that's a life upgrade. And for something that costs around $2,000 today, that's a 40 times jump. Is it utopian? Maybe impossible. Not necessarily, but it does assume XRP becomes a major global financial rail. Before you go planning boat parties and real estate deals in Dubai, let's pull things back to earth because not every realistic world gives XRP that level of dominance. So now we step into something more grounded, like the moderate global adoption scenario. This second world assumes XRP handles a smaller slice of worldwide cross-border payments. Not just SWIFT, but everything. Bank settlements, remittances, corporate payments, and international transfers. That global market moves around $200 trillion per year. So even if XRP captured just 5% of all that, we're talking 10 trillion. In that world, XRP's required liquidity drops dramatically, more like $2 trillion locked up instead of 5T. That brings the price estimate to around $33 per XRP. Not as sexy as $83, but still extremely respectable. And your 1000 XRP, that becomes about $33,000, a clean 17 times. More realistic, yes, still life-changing. Depends who you ask, but definitely the kind of outcome that keeps actual analysts paying attention. And then we get to the third universe, the conservative scenario, where XRP plays a background role as a reserve or liquidity backstop. Here, banks simply hold XRP for emergency settlement needs. If 10,000 major banks each hold $500 million in XRP, that's $500 billion. locked away. That math gives us around $8 per XRP, making 1,000 XRP equal $8,000. Not moonshot territory, but still a 4 times. And in traditional finance, a 4 times is massive. Now let's cut deeper into the real engine behind all these numbers, velocity. This is where most people screw up their calculations. And honestly, it's why you see all those childish XRP to 10,000 predictions floating around. They ignore the one thing that actually determines price, how fast XRP moves. Here's the blunt truth. If XRP moves extremely fast, like instant in and out for every transaction, then you need very little XRP in the system to support huge global volume. That keeps the price low. But if XRP moves slower, either because customers choose to hold it or because institutions want deeper liquidity buffers, then more XRP must be locked up and the price shoots up. It's not complicated, but people avoid this topic because the realities kill most of this fantasy pumping. Let's break it down the same way banks break it down. Settlement speed versus liquidity depth. Right now, Ripple's infrastructure is fast, but the world that uses it is slow. Banks don't settle instantly. They batch transfers. They reconcile ledgers at fixed intervals. They follow regulatory processes. They deal with compliance delays, correspondent banks, FX desks, confirmations, and reconciliation windows. So even if XRP can settle instantly, the entire pipeline around it slows that settlement velocity down. That reduced velocity increases the amount of XRP needed to support daily volume. And that increased demand bumps the price. That's why the numbers you saw in part 1 aren't random. They're driven by velocity assumptions based on how real banks actually operate, not crypto fantasies. Let's go deeper. In a world where XRP handles 10% of SWIFT, the actual settlement velocity would likely be slow enough, maybe 5-10 minutes per liquidity cycle, that you need trillions of dollars locked in. That's how you get the $83 valuation. Not magic, just math. On the other hand, if velocity speeds up, if banks integrate more tightly with Ripplet, use automated API flows, compress confirmation windows, and reduce compliance latency, then the required liquidity drops. That's why in the moderate 5% adoption scenario, XRP lands closer to $33. So essentially, you're looking at a slider, lower velocity, one more higher price. Higher velocity, we want lower price. But here's the twist. Most people never consider velocity isn't fully in Ripple's control. Velocity is dominated by regulation, banking processes, compliance friction, liquidity provider behavior, and risk management frameworks. In other words, XRP's price ceiling isn't only about how good the tech is, and it's about how slowly the real world moves. Now let's talk about liquidity depth, because this is the second major factor. If XRP is going to settle large value payments globally, the ecosystem needs deep liquidity pools everywhere, especially in corridors like USD-UR, USD-AED, USD, KRW, USD-JPY, and GBP-USD. These are trillion-dollar flow corridors. You can't support them with shallow pools. The deeper the pool, the more XRP must be parked inside it. This XRP isn't for trading. It's utility liquidity locked away to support transfers. This is the kind of liquidity that actually pushes prices up because it reduces circulating supply. Think of it like this. Liquidity pools are the working capital of XRP's global settlement system. The bigger the financial system that runs on XRP, the more working capital it needs. And that capital is XRP itself. That's why big adoption, Josh, big price, it's not about hype, it's about liquidity requirement math. And this is where things get interesting for your 1,000 XRP bag. Because if major banks, payment providers, remittance services, fintech, companies, and large institutions all begin using XRP for settlement, the circulating supply shrinks due to locked liquidity. Even a 10 to 15% reduction in circulating supply can add dramatic upward pressure on price. And since XRP's supply is fixed with periodic releases that become smoother over time, the long-term supply dynamics actually support price growth if utility adoption increases. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Real bank adoption absolutely will not look like the fantasy people imagine. Banks won't YOLO into XRP. They won't flip a switch overnight. They won't replace SWIFT globally in a week. It'll be measured corridor by corridor, driven by cost savings and regulatory clarity. This is why the conservative $8 scenario exists, because it's realistic that XRP becomes a reserve-backed settlement token without being the dominant global rail. That world still produces a 4x from current levels, and unlike the crazy predictions online, this one doesn't require a financial revolution. But here's where we turn the page. If we want a real sense of future value, we need to analyze real-world settlements, corridors, and volumes, because that's where we see XRP's true potential and its real limitations. Now let's get into something most people avoid because it forces them to face reality. Position sizing. Everyone throws random numbers around. Hold 10,000 XRP, hold 50,000 XRP. You need 100K to become a millionaire. But none of that is based on logic, it's just noise. So, let's break this down properly using the only thing that matters, your goals versus the asset's realistic upside. Most holders never think about why they picked a certain number, they just copy whatever some influencer posted. That's stupid. You need to map your bag size to the actual price ranges XRP can hit under different adoption states. You already saw the 4 brackets: low, medium, high, extreme. Now, let's translate them into actual holder strategy. Nodium, not doom, something you can use. 1. If you're in the low adoption belief, your target is modest. This is the group who believes XRP will grow as a niche settlement tool, but won't take over global rails. If you fall in this bracket, expecting life-changing returns from a small XRP stack is delusional. A 38 XRP needs either strong retail or moderate banking flows. That reward is fine, but only if you're not expecting financial miracles. Here's the bare minimum logic. Holding 500 XRP at this level is pointless. Holding 1,000 to 2,000 XRP gives you mild upside. Holding 5,000 to 10,000 XRP gives you meaningful upside. And this bracket is for people who want conservative growth, not generational wealth. 2. If you're in the medium adoption belief that the opportunity gets interesting, this bracket thinks XRP will become the backbone for regional banks, remittance hubs, liquidity providers, and tokenization infrastructure. If you're here, XRP is not just an asset. It's a core strategy at a realistic $85 range. These are the bag sizes that actually mean something. 1,000 XRP show good upside, 5,000 XRP very strong returns, 10,000, 20,000 XRP show serious portfolio impact. This is the group that actually understands what Ripple is doing. Real regulations, real institutions, real infrastructure. 3. If you're in the high adoption belief, prepare for volatility and patience. People in this bracket think XRP becomes the global liquidity standard, not replacing banks, but powering the back end of international payment mints. It's bold, but not insane. If you believe in this path, your XRP stack must reflect that high-risk, high-reward profile at a potential 2,580 range, 5,000 XRP. Such strong long-term growth, 10,000, 20,000 XRP, wealth building 20,000, 50,000 XRP. Sorry, life-changing if the thesis plays out. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't deserve high returns if you're not holding high-level conviction. Most people say they believe in XRP, but fold the moment the price dips. That's not conviction. That's emotional gambling. And 4, if you're in the extreme adoption bracket, that this is where people lie to themselves. Some holders believe XRP becomes a global bridge for CBDCs, sovereign liquidity, tokenized assets, and massive institutional flows. This is the rare scenario where XRP enters the 10,000 20 pluses range. Here's the simple rule. If you're aiming for millionaire status in this bracket, you need a minimum of 10,000 to 20,000 XRP and ideally more, but only if you actually understand the long-term vision and are willing to stomach insane volatility. But don't fool yourself. Most people who talk about 200 XRP are not mentally prepared for the patience, the waiting, or the uncertainty involved. Belief without backbone is useless. Here's the brutal truth XRP holders avoid. Your bag size must match your expectations. If you believe in $38, then holding 50,000 XRP is overkill. If you believe in $8,200, then holding 1,000 XRP is pointless. If you want wealth, you can't play like a beginner. If you want safety, don't pretend you're chasing generational returns. You need to choose your path, and because most people never do, they just drift. Now, let's wrap this up by hitting the part most people never want to hear. Your mindset matters more than your bag size. XRP is not a token you trade emotionally. It's an infrastructure asset tied to regulation, institutions, and utility that builds slowly and then flips instantly. If you don't understand that, you'll keep sabotaging yourself. The biggest mistake XRP holders make is thinking the market cares about their feelings or timelines. It doesn't. XRP doesn't pump because you've been waiting for years. It doesn't moon because you're tired. Markets move when fundamentals align with liquidity, regulation, and utility, not when holders get frustrated. So if you're not ready for that level of detachment, you're not ready for this asset. Let's cut the excuses and get to what actually matters. Now, 1, you need a strategy, not vibes. Most people hold XRP with zero plan. They don't know their exit points. They don't know their belief bracket, and they don't know what they'll do when things finally move. That's why most holders, yes, even XRP holders, will screw up right before the big moves. They'll sell too early, panic on the way up, or get greedy and hold too long. Here's the simplest, most realistic way to avoid that disaster. Choose your belief bracket. Low, medium, high, extreme. This determines your price expectations, right? Core. Match your bag size to your bracket. Don't talk like a high adoption believer while holding like a low adoption tourist. That contradiction will destroy you. But pre-plan your sell strategy. Not when you're emotional. Not during hype. You plan in calm times. You execute in chaos. If you don't do this, you'll eventually regret it. Guaranteed. To know what triggers XRP's actual breakout, forget the noise, forget the fake gurus. These are the only things that push XRP into new territory. Regulatory clarity, real, not Twitter rumors, bank and institutional liquidity running through ODL corridors, tokenization volume increasing, Ripple's infrastructure being used at scale, major regions adopting interoperability standards, liquidity hubs expanding globally. Everything else is distraction. And here's the tough truth. If you're expecting generational wealth before these fundamentals align, you're playing a child's version of crypto. This asset was never designed to explode randomly. XRP pumps when infrastructure aligns with utility. And when that happens, it won't move slowly, it will re-prick violently. 3. The psychological trap that wipes out 80% of holders. Here's where people mess up. XRP is a slow builder. It tests your patience. But when it moves faster than your emotions can keep up. That's when people make catastrophic decisions. Selling early because they don't want to miss profits. Waiting forever because they believe it's going higher. Panicking on corrections, adding bags too late, not adding when it's actually undervalued. You need balance. You need discipline. You need logic, not fantasy, not fear. 4. The real reason XRP still matters. Ignore the haters. Ignore the tribal drama. There are only 2 assets in crypto with real regulatory first institution-ready infrastructure. XRP and XLM. The rest are still guessing. Ripple spent a decade doing the boring work nobody else wanted. Compliance, licensing, partnerships, banking integration, payment rails, enterprise onboarding, government corridors. That's why XRP is still in the conversation while others fade out. And here's the truth you need to hear. Utility assets don't die. They evolve slowly, then explode suddenly. Your job is to survive the boring part. Everyone wants the ending. They just don't want the patience it requires. 5 final clarity before we close this series. Your XRP future depends on 5 things only. The bracket you believe in, the bag you build, the patience you maintain, the strategy you prepare, the discipline you stick to when volatility hits. If you fix these, you'll outperform 90% of crypto. If you ignore these, your long-term regret will hurt more than any dip. And that's the truth. No sugarcoating, no fantasies. This content is for educational and formational purposes only. Nothing in this video should be considered financial or investment advice. You should always do your own research, assess your own risk tolerance, and consult with a licensed financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Cryptocurrency markets are extremely volatile. Never invest more than you can afford to lose.